All right, everybody. Lots happened over the last 24 hours. So let's go ahead and read off this post from Donald Trump, where he said the United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement. Details to follow. There will be a news conference today at 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So essentially, the Trump administration just FAFO'd Maduro and the Venezuela regime. Now we're going to talk today about a few things. One, we're going to talk about is this legal? Is this constitutional? We're going to ask why it was done in the first place. I think most people, if you've been following what's going on in Venezuela, have some idea with respect to what the Maduro regime has been up with the cartel down there that essentially operates as part of the government. Not to mention that Venezuela has incredibly close ties with both communist China and the Russians with respect to both financial aid that they depend on, as well as military equipment. And so the things that we're gonna ask about is, again, is this constitutional? Was it necessary? Is it in America's interest? And why are so many people that have been very, very skeptical of U.S. foreign military intervention cheering on this? And is that intellectually inconsistent? For those of you who don't know, let me give you my background real quick. Okay, so before I was ever in politics, ever in the state legislature here in Virginia, I was first a member of the 82nd Airborne Division as an 11 Bravo, which is an infantryman. I was then a member of the 25th Infantry Division over in Hawaii, and then after 9/11, I volunteered for U.S. Army Special Forces, kind of commonly known as Green Berets, where I served as an 18 Bravo, which is a Special Forces Weapons Sergeant, and then 18 Fox Special Forces Intel Sergeant. I did a couple combat tours over in Iraq and did some deployments, non-combat deployments to other areas as well. And I'm someone that has been very both critical and critical of U.S. military involvement, especially when we talk about the war on terror. It wasn't because I didn't think we needed military strikes against Al Qaeda or to fight terrorism. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not an isolationist. I'm not a non-interventionist in the sense that I don't think it's ever appropriate for the United States military to be involved or to launch military operations overseas. However, I have been very, very frustrated with what I believe is a lack of constitutional justification for U.S. military involvement. And I remain consistent with that. But I do think that there's something different here. And this is not trying to, shy away from the fact that I still remain skeptical of the United States military being involved in foreign conflicts. It's more about reprioritizing why we get involved, to what extent we get involved, and what is the overall justification for what we're doing, and what is the constitutional justification for it. And so one of the first tweets that went out that, from someone I really respect is Mike Lee. And Senator Mike Lee, when all this was going on 6 hours ago, he put out, I look forward to learning what, if anything, might constitutionally justify this action in the absence of a declaration of war or authorization for the use of military force. And of course, there are some people that, I don't accept this false dilemma. I don't accept the false dilemma of I have to, two things can be true at once. I cannot like Nicolas Maduro, just like I cannot like Vladimir Putin, just like I cannot like the Ayatollah. That doesn't necessarily mean I want the United States military to, go overseas and engage in a 10 to 20 year expedition to try to turn dictatorships into parliamentary democracies, right? I can dislike a regime without thinking the United States military or the United States government or the United States taxpayer has an obligation to change it. However, we also need to differentiate between a war and a surgical military strike. We do have to differentiate between those two things. It's not because you can't claim that a surgical military strike can also be an act of war. But the reason why we have the War Powers Act was try to distinguish and to try to determine what is the power of the executive branch with respect to the use of military force, and when is it necessary or legally required to either notify Congress or get congressional approval. And so the first thing I want to say right off the bat is I have people that I deeply respect on both sides of this particular debate on whether or not what Trump just did in Venezuela was constitutionally justifiable. Right? Most people I see out there are saying, yeah, Nicolas Maduro is a criminal. He's a crook. He's stolen at least 2 elections in Venezuela. So it's not like anybody is elevating him as a legitimate leader of Venezuela. I mean, you might get some people on the left that are doing that, but not typically on the right. But I do think people are asking some legitimate questions of like, hey, I might like the result. I might like the administration. I might get some special pride in the United States military being able to conduct a highly complex operation effectively, but I still got questions, and I think I don't think that's a position that should automatically be shouted down, or be seen as weak or whatnot. I think it's legitimate for people to ask these questions because we do want to avoid getting involved in 10 to 20 year expeditions to try to, put the U.S. taxpayer and American blood and treasure at risk. To try to stabilize areas that are quite frankly not interested in our way of life, our form of government, or even necessarily being all that stable. And so I think that's an important thing to ask about. So Mike Lee tweeted that out. And then a little bit later, he tweeted out another thing, or he posted on X another thing. He goes, just got off the phone with Secretary Rubio. He informed me that Nicolas Maduro had been arrested by U.S. personnel to stand trial on criminal charges in the United States, and that the kinetic action we saw tonight was deployed to protect and defend those executing the arrest warrant. This action, and then Mike elaborates here, he goes, this action likely falls within the president's inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to protect U.S. personnel from an actual or imminent attack. Thank you, Secretary Rubio, for keeping me apprised. So the argument goes something like this, that this was not something where we were launching an invasion for the purpose of taking over a country, or even necessarily for regime change, even though that's going to be the effect. That this was essentially going after what the United States declared to be both a criminal that had been indicted in U.S. courts, as well as a illegitimate head of state. And if you go back and you read anything about the election crisis of 2018 or the most recent one, and we'll get into that just a little bit. I mean, it seems fairly obvious that Maduro is essentially ruling the country he didn't win his elections. He arguably lost the one in 2018, and by everything I'm reading on this, he lost overwhelmingly in 2024. In fact, he didn't win a single province from what I can tell. It looked like Gonzalez won the election with about 68% of the vote. But again, whenever you have elections like this being held in countries which, have some, let's just say some difficulties with respect to ensuring that there's no voter fraud or things of that nature, it's hard to tell what the actual numbers are at the end of the day. But that's what the Trump administration is saying. It's like we essentially engaged in a law enforcement action that required military support due to the unique nature of the person that we were attempting to arrest and bring back for trial. So that's the official narrative coming out of the Trump administration. Some people are going to say, okay, well, that sounds very, very convenient. Theoretically, you can indict any world leader in a U.S. court and now justify the United States military being used to go in there, capture someone, and bring him back. And I suppose that's a legitimate argument. The question is do we think that's highly likely? The response I would say to someone like that is, okay, well, what are you supposed to do if you do have a legitimate case where you have a leader that is, again, an illegitimate leader of their own country and actively engaging in what, I would argue that there's sufficient evidence to justify that he's actively engaging in subversive behavior toward the United States with respect to the cartels running in Venezuela and the importation of drugs into the United States. How are you supposed to contend with that? Because you can say all day long that, well, that's a law enforcement action. Okay, but what are you supposed to do about it if it's taking place in a foreign country and they essentially have safe harbor in that foreign country? How are you supposed to execute successful law enforcement activities without military support in order to potentially bring that person to justice? So on one hand, I can understand the concern that would this give any future president carte blanche ability to manipulate the courts, determine a foreign world leader a criminal, and then justify U.S. military force to go in and do something about it? Could this be used as a pretext to get the United States involved in wars that we couldn't or shouldn't be involved in? And again, I get it, but I think it's somewhat of a dubious claim, and in part because at least up to this point, it's not like a full-scale invasion of Venezuela was launched, right? It's not as if the 82nd Airborne Division is securing Cartagena right now, and we've got follow-on troops doing a beach invasion to take over the country. It's not as if full-scale U.S. forces are being launched in the way that they were in Iraq and Venezuela, or excuse me, Iraq and Afghanistan, two conflicts which I do believe a declaration of war would have been appropriate and should have been required by Congress. But everything I'm saying right now is kind of my opinion. So let's just take a look at some of the main provisions of the War Powers Resolution or War Powers Act. So the War Powers Act of 1973 requires the president to consult Congress before introducing U.S. forces into hostilities, report within 48 hours, and withdraw troops within 60 to 90 days unless Congress authorizes the action, aiming to restore the balance of war powers by limiting unilateral executive action in undeclared conflicts. Key provisions include mandatory reporting, consultation, and a time limit for sustaining forces without a congressional vote, with expedited procedures for Congress to approve or terminate military involvement. So there is some question on whether or not the consultant or the consulting component was exercised. It does seem like, again, the president has informed Congress, is about to do a press conference too, so that'll hit the 48 hours mark. And then as far as troops being withdrawn within 60 to 90 days, unless Congress authorizes a longer period, at least at this point, seems to also have been met. And so I think you're going to have a hard time. I think you're going to have a hard time making the argument that at least most of what the president has done here doesn't fall within the War Powers Act. The big question is going to be, is this an act of war because you deliberately went after a head of state? So, for instance, when it came to blowing up, boats that the United States government said were transferring drugs in the United States, which I believe they accurately said were transferring drugs in the United States. When you're blowing them up in international waters, I would say that falls pretty neatly within the War Powers Act. When you're doing surgical strikes against maybe terrorist organizations or things like that, again, whether you like it or not, or agree with the action or not, it seems to fall fairly neatly within the War Powers Act. The real question becomes when you actually take out a head of state. If anybody took out the head of state of the United States, if anybody took out our president, we would consider it an act of war, right? Like, we just agree that we would consider that an act of war. And so that's the argument that's being made here is, look, you can say whatever you want about he was indicted in U.S. courts. You can say whatever you want about it fit within the parameters of the 60 to 90 days for troop deployments, 48 hours of consulting Congress. But there's no doubt that this constitutes an act of war. And theoretically, if you're going to engage in an act of war, you should declare war. Okay. So again, I think that's a fair argument for people to make. Here's what I think we need to look at with respect to Venezuela specifically, and with respect to the way that Trump has conducted military operations versus the way maybe Bush or Obama or previous administrations have. I, again, had a big problem with the idea of us launching full-scale, multi-year, in one case, multi-decade wars with no declaration of war. We were actively deploying the National Guard, which, again, I carried the Defend the Guard Act in Virginia, which says that the National Guard should not be able to be deployed overseas for foreign conflicts unless there has been a declaration of war. I still stand by that. I still think that is an excellent piece of legislation and should be carried again in Virginia this year. But I do also think that I want to list out a couple of reasons why I think people are viewing what Trump is doing differently than the way that Obama or Bush or previous regimes have carried out operations. And this is what I wrote on it. And this is kind of what I want us to discuss a little bit here. Because I can already see some people some people in the comments are going to think that I'm not being pro-Trump enough. Some people are going to think I'm going back on things that I believed in the beginning. And so that's really the question here. Somebody's saying my mic is off here. All right, is that better? I've had issues with the mic before. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, I tried to switch the microphone and it gave me some issues. So I'm just going to try to do the best I can with what I got right now. Originally, it said I was fine, so apologize for that. Um, here's what I tweeted out. There's going to be an interesting discussion because constitutional legitimacy matters. And again, even though I'm a big supporter of the Trump administration, I still believe that. I believe that presidents need to follow the Constitution. And I believe we need a stricter interpretation of some of the powers within Article 2 of the Constitution to make sure that we're not getting involved in foreign conflicts that we shouldn't be involved in. I said, but if people are wondering why Trump's military strikes are viewed differently than Bush or Obama, it's this. They are largely seen as understandable, in line with American interests, and not likely to be followed up with a foolish 10 to 20-year attempt to turn Muslim dictatorships into parliamentary democracies. He used the military to achieve a clear and well-defined national security objective, not some open-ended, nebulous, make the world safe for democracy slogan. I understand the concerns about foreign military operations, but let's discuss this in good faith. And that's what I'm hoping happens next. I'm also not sure that it will. In part because we've gotten to a point where we are so polarized that it's become this idea that if you don't automatically either endorse or oppose whatever the Trump administration does, then you're a bad guy, right? You're the enemy. And I'm going to be honest, my issue with this does come back to an interpretation of the Constitution, because while the War Powers Act certainly has legal authority, the Constitution still reigns. And I like the result of this. Like, I'm not going to lie. Thus far, I like the result of this. I like Maduro being removed from Venezuela because, again, I do think he stole 2 elections. I do think he's a brutal and oppressive socialist dictator. But the real question comes down to is, okay, did we follow the proper constitutional process before we put men and women in the United States military in harm's way? And the answer to that right now is, I don't know. There's parts about this I like. There's parts about this I'm not too sure of. And so I am interested to see what the president says at 11 today. I do want to see what the long-term explanation of, or what the detailed explanation of this action is. I do want to hear people discuss what the potential implications are, because people have already pointed out that, okay, we got Maduro. What happens in Venezuela next? Now, they appear to be celebrating in the streets, right? But look, I've seen this before. I remember when there was celebration in the streets when Saddam was taken down. That wasn't the end of the story. And so I don't know what happens next in Venezuela. Maybe they do have a peaceful transition of power with relatively little bloodshed, and everything's fine as a result. But yeah, I don't know. We've seen this play out before, where we thought everything was going to go well, and then lo and behold, it went very, very poorly. And the question is going to be is, what is the United States going to see as its obligation as a result of that? Is the United States now going to say, well, because we overthrew Maduro, it's our responsibility to back the next person going in, or to provide military support in order to provide stability? Because I'm going to tell you right now, if that's what happens next, not worth it. Probably not worth it, right? If all of a sudden now we got to send the 82nd and the 101st and infantry units down there to secure Venezuela, I'm going to have a real problem with that. And so I don't think it's unreasonable for someone that, again, has been in this situation before, has been on the business end of U.S. foreign policy, to say, okay, what happens next? Because one of the things I have appreciated about Donald Trump is that in the past, he has understood the value of what we might have used to call a punitive expedition, which is to say that, again, not every military strike has to involve us invading, taking over a country, and trying to set up a parliamentary democracy. All right, if you look at what Reagan did to the Iranians in the 80s, the Iranians were going in, they were mining the Straits of Hormuz, and the next thing you know, the fleet goes over there. We sink about a quarter of the Iranian Navy, and they decide they don't want to mine the Straits of Hormuz anymore. Okay, should we have declared war for that? Should we have gone in and invaded Iran over that? I would argue no. I would argue that the military action that we conducted at that particular time and place was sufficient to achieve the limited aims that we had at that particular time. Trump, I feel, has been willing to do the same thing. I feel like Trump has a natural disinclination to get us involved in, again, a massive foreign invasion of another country. But when you remove the head of state for another country, there's going to necessarily be questions about what happens next and what is the United States' obligation as a result of actively participating, actively, conducting that operation. So that's the part that I think. That's the part that I think there needs to be a legitimate conversation. Don't assume that everybody's a bad guy all of a sudden, simply because they have concerns about this. I think this needs to be talked out. Now, let me say this too. With respect to what the left has to say about this, I don't care. That's just where I'm at. Welcome to 2026. This is the year that I just don't care anymore about the left's arguments on these things. And it's not because I still don't believe that truth is supposed to be our ultimate objective. It's not because I don't believe that we shouldn't be able to apply logic, reason, facts, empiricism in order to come to logical conclusions. And if those logical conclusions, if the truth is that the right got it wrong, or somebody that the right generally associates themselves with or praises got it wrong, then we have to be honest about that, right? Truth has to reign supreme. If that is not a defining characteristic of the right, then we're in trouble. By the same token, what the left has demonstrated to me over several decades now is the truth is not their ultimate objective. Their ultimate objective is power. And so they will use logic and reason, facts and evidence insofar as it supports their position. And the moment it doesn't, they quickly throw it overboard and they don't care anymore. And we see this all the time. There's this thing in the news. I've talked about this before. Rogan, so many other people have talked about this. But it's the way the media reports on things, the left-wing media reports on things. It always starts off with, whenever the right notices something, the initial response is, that's not happening. Followed up by, well, why do you care if it's happening? Followed up by, okay, it's actually happening, but here's why it's a good thing. And then followed up by, you're a bigot if you don't like the thing that we told you wasn't happening is actually happening. And so as a result of that, whenever the left comes to the debate, I'm just not that interested in what they have to say anymore, because even if they're presenting something that in the moment seems like a reasonable argument, I know for a fact, if new evidence presents itself and says, hey, okay, the argument that you brought was pretty decent, was actually pretty good, but here's the evidence which actually answers your question. Their response will never be, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. The response will always be, well, you're a bigot or you're a racist or you're a sexist because you don't agree with me. And so I'm not really interested anymore on what the left's arguments are on this. But that doesn't mean that people that are still willing to debate in good faith can't come and have issues with this. So Cyber Chaos said, I'd purposely have to remove my frontal lobe to pretend this isn't an act of war. I mean, this is a litmus test for honesty. Regime change will work this time, guys. We'll be welcomed as liberators. And again, I think what Cyber Chaos is bringing up here is I think it's a very legitimate concern. I don't know if, again, I don't know if I'm there yet with respect to whether or not I should have the same concern for this that I do for things like what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. I do think the skepticism with this idea that, well, this time the regime change will go differently. Is it possible that you can remove a head of state and maybe not have a total peaceful transition of power, but you can actually that enough people within that country will be thankful that person is removed and that you can get back to what could be called regular order, right? Or legitimate elections. Yeah, it's possible. The problem is that it hasn't been something that we've seen play out very well in recent history, right? That's the most generous way I could describe it. Klein said, I hope this goes differently, but with the current track record, we will hand it back to another Maduro regime in 20 years. So this is, Klein, this is one thing that I think you bring up, that this is one of the things that I feel a little bit differently about this, because obviously when we talk about handing it back to, like, that's usually a reference to kind of like what happened with Afghanistan, right? We fought in Afghanistan for 20 years to change out the Taliban with the Taliban. What the hell was the point? And while I think that's a very, very legitimate critique in Afghanistan, and while I think it's a legitimate skepticism that we should have about any sort of U.S.-backed regime change, the thing I wonder about here with Maduro specifically is, what is Trump's ultimate play on this? Is he essentially saying, look, based off of the Monroe Doctrine, which for those of you who don't know, the Monroe Doctrine, essentially kind of the Cliff Notes version is the United States didn't want, at that time, European powers, but really any other powers operating, colonizing and doing other things within the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine kind of asserted at a time where we really didn't have the military power to assert it, but asserted that the Western Hemisphere was kind of our domain and that we were the major player in the Western Hemisphere. Again, this is a very Cliff Notes, unnuanced version of the Monroe Doctrine. I know the mic isn't working. What? Okay. Sorry, my wife is telling me your mic's not working right. Like, I know, sorry. However, let's war game this for a second. Let's say Trump really was primarily interested in the fact that he saw Maduro as an illegitimate head of state because he'd stolen 2 elections. He saw him as a socialist dictator, and he saw him as someone that was actively engaged in what he considered to be hostile actions toward the United States. So let's say his primary objective was, I'm just taking Maduro out of the picture. What happens next in Venezuela is up to the Venezuelans. Yes, the United States probably has some opinions on who should be in charge next or what the election should look like. Probably has some opinions on who we don't want to take over next. But the question of how involved will we get in that process? That I think is an important question, because like I said, I'll say it right now. If Trump says, and now for our next move, we're going to send down the 82nd Airborne and the 101st, and we're going to secure Venezuela so they can have peaceful life, I am not going to be happy about that. I like, there is, as much as I like the Trump administration, there is no world where we have massive follow-on military operations in Venezuela where I think, oh, this is going to be a great idea. Like, I'm sorry. I can't imagine any world where I support that play. Maybe there is one, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. Certainly not one that wouldn't declare or wouldn't require a declaration of war by Congress. But I'm trying to look at all the different scenarios here. So if he does that, or if let's just we remove Maduro from power, and now we're going to let Venezuelans essentially try to form a government free from Nicolas Maduro, the cartels, and the military from dominating the electoral process. Could we get a better result than the one that we currently have right now? Yeah, I think we could. Are we likely to? Based off of what I'm seeing right now, I think we are likely to get a government that would be more friendly to the United States than the one we currently have, only because I think it would be very, very difficult to not achieve that in the short term. To your question about the long term, what happens in 20 years? In 20 years, are we just right back to, kind of what it was before? That's too hard to tell. And I think part of the problem we have to, whenever we look at this, when we look at the long term, we need to understand that there's a number of things that can take place that are completely outside our realm of control, unless we're willing to dedicate time and resources that, quite frankly, I don't want us to dedicate, because I think we got too many problems in our own backyard. But does that mean you shouldn't do anything in the midterm, or does that mean you shouldn't do anything in the interim in the hopes that you can actually achieve a better result? And that part, I don't know. I have a hard time. I have a hard time saying that, well, because in 20 years things could be worse, we shouldn't do anything right now. I think trying to predict that little far is a little bit too difficult. It would essentially prevent us from being able to do anything, even sometimes when it would be necessary and justified. But again, I think that I am open to hearing people that want to debate this in good faith say, I think this is a mistake. I'm not sure yet. I know it's kind of a weak position to take. I'm really not sure yet, because I want to hear what the administration's justification is at 11. I will say this: full kudos to the professionalism and effectiveness of the United States military, because at least at this stage, it seems like they pulled off an incredibly complex operation, and I don't know of any casualties to American forces yet as a result. But this was not a small op. Like if you take some of the constitutional questions out of it, or you take some of the other questions out of it just for a second and look at it just from a tactical standpoint. I mean, when we eventually find out all the forces that were involved in conducting this operation, I think it's hard to say this wasn't incredibly impressive, and we will probably be studying this within the special operations community for some time now on how this was conducted. So yeah. Anyways, that's kind of where I'm at on this overall. I'm happy Maduro's gone. I certainly hope the Venezuelan people can take back their country from, again, a socialist dictatorship. At the same time that New York City is handing their city over to a socialist dictator. Okay, that's a little bit harsh, but not totally. So I wish the best for Venezuela at this point. I do not think it's the United States government's responsibility, the United States military's responsibility, the United States taxpayers' responsibility to go in and make sure that this is all okay for Venezuela. I don't think that's our obligation. And so insofar as they've been provided an opportunity to fix their country without a socialist strongman in place, that could be a net benefit both for Venezuela and the United States. But it remains to be seen what follows on next. Like I said, there is a way that I could see through this and say, okay, maybe on the net this was okay. But like I said, if this leads to further U.S. involvement or invasion of Venezuela, if we take on the responsibility for securing Venezuela, I just don't see any world where I support that, and I don't see any world where I'm quiet about it either, because we do have enough problems at home that we have to deal with right now to where we have to make sure that insofar as we're engaged in international affairs, and look, I'm not someone that we've got enough problems at home. We can, two things can be true at once. We can have enough problems at home, which should be our primary focus, while at the same time understanding that not every that doesn't mean we completely withdraw from the international scene. We just have to be careful and judicious on when we get involved, and there has to be a legitimate and very, very obvious U.S. interest, U.S. reason on why we're getting involved. Alberta said, as an outsider, I'll vote to Canada. This action by Trump could be following his inclination to save lives. If he prosecutes Maduro, then hopefully they can stop the cartels and stop blowing up boats. I think that's going to be the overall strategic and moral objective that the Trump administration lays out. That essentially there was no way to truly stop the cartels that were operating inside of Venezuela without dealing with Maduro. He's going to use so that the moral issue is going to be drugs coming in the United States. The kind of the U.S. strategic interest is going to be, we had a hostile regime in Venezuela that was closely aligning themselves with both China and Russia. The legal justification for this is going to be probably a combination of presidential authority within the Constitution, War Powers Act, and the fact that Maduro was indicted in court and not seen as the legitimate head of state. That's going to be the legal argument. So that's what I think will be the strategic or U.S. interest or strategic argument, legal argument, and moral argument for why this operation was launched. And we'll see what the administration has to say out here. Tammy said, I don't want U.S. police the world. I want to afford gas in my car. Well, so a lot of other skepticism about this is going to be the fact that Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves on the planet, right? Because there's a lot of people that have brought up, like, look, if you want to fight cartels, fine, but your major cartels are actually in Mexico, not in Venezuela. So is the real reason you're doing this is because Venezuela has such large oil reserves. Mexico also has very large oil reserves. And so I don't know if the oil is going to factor into this. The people that will knee-jerk reactions say no blood for oil, I don't think they are being very intellectually honest on how important oil is to making sure that modern economies can actually operate and function, and what the potential cost would be. Now that doesn't mean we should launch offensive military operations to secure oil anytime that we want to, but it is something that usually factors into our strategic considerations. To your comment about not wanting the U.S. to police the world, I completely agree. This is something where I've had people before when they want to talk about Ukraine, or they want to talk about various conflicts going on in other places. And the way I usually look at it is, I go with the two things can be true at once. I can look at something and think that is horrible, it should not be happening, without believing that it is automatically the responsibility of the US government, the US service member, the US taxpayer to make it right. There are some times where other places in the world have to figure it out for themselves. And one of the things that we have seen is that sometimes intervention can yield positive results, right? I'm not one of these guys where it's all one thing or all the other. There are times when military intervention can be necessary, appropriate, moral, legal, and can yield positive results. There are other times where, especially when it's not done correctly or the objectives are not laid out clearly, where it's done in such a way to where you've actually exacerbated the problem. You haven't fixed anything. You may have achieved temporary peace, but you haven't actually helped to resolve the underlying issues. This is why one of the primary objectives of military operations is to destroy the war-making capacity of your enemy, whether it be a country, whether it be a rogue state, whether it be a terrorist organization. If you're not destroying their capacity to commit violence, to conduct warfare, then theoretically you're not really achieving much. And that's what we've seen with a lot of quote unquote peacekeeping operations in certain parts of the world, is that they don't actually resolve the underlying problems. All they do is stall the violence, which is inevitably going to take place as soon as the peacekeepers leave. And so one of the things that I'm very skeptical of is whenever we look at foreign entanglements or wars or conflicts, is can we actually identify very, very clear U.S. objectives? Are those objectives attainable? And what is it going to take to attain them? Because there are times where we can look at something and say, okay, we could act and we could affect something. But if we actually do the long-term analysis, we come to the conclusion that, okay, and it's not really going to change anything. And so as much as we might not like it, it might be that those people over there have to figure out what it is that they're going to fight for, what it is they're going to die for, and what they need to do in order to maintain security without foreign involvement or assistance. And this sounds horrible to some people, especially when you have really bad things going on. And all I can say is that, look, the United States government, the United States military is not the only way to deal with a problem. There is this inclination to look at the most powerful kid on the block or the richest kid on the block and say, well, why don't you do something? And it might be that the answer is because it's not our fight. Or it might be that the answer is that because if we get involved at this stage, it's not actually going to achieve the end results that you or we desire. And sometimes that's the hard answer. Sometimes the hard answer is that conflict has to work itself out. And again, none of us are satisfied by that, because nobody likes to see what we perceive to be as injustice taking place. But we also have to understand that, it's not always that power or money can fix the problem the way it needs to be fixed. And if the United States is going to get involved expecting a quick fix, and then we find out later it's 20 years and we still haven't fixed it, well, then what happens? Will you withdraw? And now you haven't allowed other processes to take place, which might have been more conducive to fixing the underlying problems within that particular region. This is another reason why the United States getting involved in certain conflicts for which there isn't a clearly defined objective and a clearly defined United States interest. This is why it leads to us. Improper analysis on what the underlying problems are and what our involvement will actually achieve. Because sometimes we will view things through the mindset of an American or a Western mindset, and we'll come to certain conclusions that are perfectly logical to us that make no sense to the areas that we're actually operating on. Jay said, timing on this is convenient. As the massive tax fraud comes up, this offensive happens. Not saying to be an isolationist, but we've got to fix the fraud. And Jay, legitimate. Here's what I would say on this. When we say the timing is convenient, the implication is that this was launched in order to cover up something else. Now, I totally believe that that sort of reasoning is plausible, is possible, and that the government does do things like that in order to cover up for things going on at home. The question that I have, though, is that while that can be an explanation, it's not the only reasonable explanation. I think there is a reasonable explanation for why Trump launched this operation. I want to hear more on the details and the timing, hopefully coming up at 11 a.m. Eastern with the press conference, coming up in like 40 minutes or so. But again, so I don't discount that, governments will launch overseas operations to distract from what's going on at home. There's no question that happens. Tale as old as time, but it's not the only reason. And so I want to give the Trump administration an opportunity to explain why this operation at this time was the proper way to do it. And again, it could be that there were timing things from a tactical standpoint, from a planning standpoint, that just made sense to launch the operation when they did. I don't know, because I obviously wasn't involved in the operation, but I'm certainly willing to hear the administration out on why they thought the timing for this was important. Man says, as a 25-year-old American, I just don't care for the U.S. to be involved in another foreign conflict. I lived my whole life seeing this in the Middle East. Why do you think Gen Z is so against any support for the Israeli government? I certainly understand not wanting to get involved in more conflicts in the Middle East. Part of the reason why we've been involved in those conflicts has to do with oil. And again, people like, oh my gosh, you're going to die for oil. No, what it is we're going to fight wars when it comes to arguably the most strategic resource in a modern economy. That's what it comes down to. As far as support for the Israeli government, I think that, look, I'm totally open to people being skeptical of governments all over the world, to include our own. I think skepticism of government intention and power is the natural place that we should start. I think some of the here's what I don't get. I don't get some people that seem to be very skeptical of the Israeli government and not at all skeptical of the Qatari government. Right, that's the part where all of a sudden this breaks down for me. Is when someone says, "Look, I don't want any foreign aid going anywhere," I understand that. When somebody says, "I'm skeptical of governments everywhere," I understand that. When somebody says, "I'm more skeptical of governments that obviously have hostile intentions and a completely different, cultural and operating system to my own than governments that do have one that I can relate to," I think that also makes sense. But yeah, that's the part that I kind of, when it comes down to the criticism of the Israeli government, the thing I want to know is, are the same people who are criticizing the Israeli government, also criticizing the governments of countries that see Israel as an enemy, but also see the West, the United States, as an enemy? And when I see intellectual consistency, that's someone I can have a conversation with in good faith. When I see intellectual inconsistency, I'm like, okay, now I'm not sure I buy this. Philip said, will you stay live and give analysis at the press conference? Probably not, in part because I'm pissed that my mic isn't working again. I don't know why. I don't know what the problem is with this. I got to get it figured out. But the other thing too is I just kind of want to sit down and review that. So we'll see. Eat says, this isn't foreign. This is our doorstep. Don't confuse the 1,000-year wars for a little country invading the U.S. and refusing to take their people back. And again, this goes to the issue where it's not just about drugs coming in the United States from Venezuela, but it's also about illegal immigration from Venezuela. And again, I think that's also one of the justifications that's going to be used. And the thing that will help differentiate us just getting involved in a 1,000-year-old conflict versus us addressing something that is a very, clear and present danger to the United States will be found somewhat in what Trump's justification is. And there may be an immigration component to this as well. What people on the other side will probably say is that, well, as soon as Venezuela got a little bit of pressure, they started taking people back. But we'll see. Again, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens with respect to the press conference at 11. I think I got to all the questions. If I didn't get to one of your questions, let me scroll up here real quick. Okay, here we go. Sorry, Whitfield. What is the current stability of Venezuela, and will it devolve into another tribal-ruled state like in the Middle East? I don't think we can make fair comparisons with the Middle East. It's a very different environment, in part because whenever you look at the Middle East, you are looking at predominantly tribal societies. You're also looking at Islam and Sharia law, which has a completely different impact on things when we're talking about kind of the Western version of stability. The Western version of stability usually rests with this idea of, representative government, free and fair elections, freedom of speech. Like, we consider a government stable when it has all of those things. So we almost we kind of conflate sometimes stability with a free and open society. And there's a lot of countries that are theoretically stable that are not free and open, right? And that doesn't mean that's the ideal state. I would argue that it's not. But I think what's going to happen in Venezuela is you are going to have various political parties and factions fighting over this, and you will have elements from the Maduro regime, the military, the drug cartels, and keep in mind, in Venezuela, a lot of the drug cartels operate through the government. It's almost like a faction of the government rather than a completely independent entity that is applying outside pressure. So in Mexico, the cartels play a lot of outside pressure on the government. In Venezuela, the cartels were operating within and kind of through the government, and there's some distinction there. Again, that's a very I'm nowhere being as nuanced as I probably should be with that, but there is a distinction between those two things. And so I do, there's no way I think we just go from, oh, look at all the happy Venezuelans voting for their leader and everything's fine. But if you believe the last election results with Gonzalez, so this was in, let me see here, the last election results with Gonzalez, they believe that Gonzalez won, let me see here, yeah, 28 July 2024, okay? So not that long ago. And looking at the map here, you can go on Wikipedia and look this up. I apologize. I'm not, let me see if I can just share this on my screen here real quick. Let me see here. There we go. Okay. All right. So if you look at this and you buy these numbers, right, which, you know, again, Gonzalez, who was part of, he was more of kind of a center-right candidate, but he was part of a coalition that included just about everybody, if we're being honest. And they say that he won overall with you know, a significant majority. I mean, and you look at that right there, it's, you know, I don't know. Some of these things are confusing with respect to the popular vote. But most people believe that Maduro lost in 2018, lost again in 2024, and has essentially just been holding control by declaring every election result that doesn't achieve him what he wants as being illegitimate. Yeah, so it's difficult to tell. But what that suggests to me, like if these numbers can be trusted, what it does suggest to me is that there is enough support for someone other than Maduro. So I do think you probably have a significant majority of Venezuelans that want a major departure from what they've had. The real question is, like right now, it's okay, how likely then are they to get one leader that they can kind of rally behind in order to fill that spot? And I don't know the answer to that question. I know that in the past, the United States has been way too optimistic on who that person would be. You know, we've seen that in Afghanistan. We've seen that in Libya. We've seen that in other countries where we think, oh, well, here's the guy that everyone agrees on. Yeah, we find out real quickly that's not true. Erudite Fuzz said, on top of immigration and trafficking, this is also about sending a message to China about its vassals in Taiwan. I think you're right on there. I mean, China had an emissary in Venezuela negotiating deals. Venezuela has been largely dependent on China and Russia for infusions of cash and for military equipment. And China has long time been making a play. China has been, in many respects, violating what would be considered the, you know, our version of our understanding of the Monroe Doctrine. And so I think Erudite Fuzz is absolutely correct on this, that this is not just about what's happening in Venezuela. This is also about sending a message to China that this is our sphere of influence. And insofar as you mess around here, it's not going to be worth your time because we'll make sure that it doesn't pan out the way you want it. Again, we'll see what China does with respect to this. People are saying that China is signaling that they're going to still be involved. Here's what people need to understand about China. China is in nowhere near as strong a position as they're oftentimes made out to be. They have massive issues with respect to their own population. They have huge currency problems. They have a housing bubble that would make our housing bubble look minuscule by comparison. They have 30 million more young men than they do young women in the country, which is a recipe for disaster. You know, India is emerging as well. China's got massive issues, and their ability to launch complex military operations is a lot more suspect than I think people appreciate. I think people look at the size of their military, they look at the investment that's made in their military, and they don't recognize how much corruption has gone into play there. So China's not as strong as they like to project, and as much as some people like to suggest that they are. And so I do think Trump is trying to send a message that we are as powerful as we say we are, and China needs to get out of our sphere of influence. How do you think the UN will react to this action? Because the United States essentially has a veto on the Security Council, there's not much that they can do. But there's no question that a variety of countries will present resolutions. Here's what I will tell you: I don't care, and I mean that. I'm not just saying that flippantly. I don't think the United States should even be in the United Nations anymore. I think all the United Nations does is give legitimacy to a lot of really, really bad regimes. And the fraud, the corruption that they're engaged in, not to mention the fact that the United States fundamentally is a leftist entity at this point. And so I don't know why the United States wants to participate and give billions of dollars to an organization that we know is corrupt and that we know is there to push left-wing progressive socialist ideology. That's what it's there to do at this point. And while we can veto things that it wants to do, which that might be some benefit. In the end, I think it's more trouble than it's worth. And I think if the United States left, it would drastically lose legitimacy, which I think would be appropriate at this point. Nick, too dumb to think about long-term consequences while saying we should act abroad for American interests. Yeah, that's it, Yellow. I'm just too dumb. Because what would I know about engaged in foreign? Oh, that's right. I did 2 combat tours in Iraq, and I actually understand long-term consequences of some of these things. And I sat here and mentioned potential long-term consequences and why that could be problematic. So, but no, you're right. Everyone who doesn't agree with you is just an idiot. See, this is the problem. This is the problem that I have. Like, again, when it comes to like the far left and they talk about things, I don't care anymore because I don't believe they argue in good faith. But if on the right, we're going to have the same thing where we refuse to argue in good faith or consider things, or we just say that everyone's an idiot if they don't automatically reinforce what I believe. Well, screw you too, dude. Honestly, I don't care. I don't have time for it anymore. I've been consistent on how I thought about these things, on what I've advocated for, and legislation I've carried, and I've lived at the business end of it. So no, I'm not negating long-term consequences. What I've said is I have appreciated how Donald Trump has used military strikes in the past. I have appreciated that he has been very, very prone to try to end wars. And so therefore, I am willing to listen to his explanation with the understanding that Venezuela did have a bad regime. It was very hostile to the United States. It was very cozy with the Russians and the Chinese. Right. I understand that they were that administration was our enemy, not the Venezuelan people, but that administration. Now, does that mean I think that removing Maduro is automatically going to equal puppy dogs and lollipops on the streets of Caracas? No. But I'm willing to hear this administration out because I think they've established a track record of not getting us involved in decades-long, wars to try to, make the world safe for democracy. And this is one of the problems that I have with political discourse. And I say this as someone that, again, didn't just deploy overseas, but was also in a state legislature. Nothing was more frustrating to me than when I had established a very consistent voting record, a very consistent pattern of explanation of reasoning for what I did, why I did it. I had established loyalty for my principles and beliefs. And then something would happen, like in a committee or a subcommittee, something would change, and I would vote differently. And instead of people saying, hey, Nick, this seems strange, why did you do it? It was, oh, see, you're just like everybody else. You're a traitor. And I was like, screw you, man. No, what happened was I saw something that happened in a subcommittee that you didn't know about. And I saw something that changed to a bill that was bad. And so I withdrew my support. Or I changed, or I didn't decide to support something because they changed it in a way that I thought it needed to be changed. And so that's how I feel about the Trump administration. When they do something that I'm like, ooh, I'm not too sure about this, I am willing to hear them out, precisely because I don't think they want to get us involved in a bunch of foreign expeditions and adventures. Right? So that's where I'm at. Again, if you don't like that, or if you think it's a problem, fine. I don't care. You're free to say what you want. But I find it problematic when we can't even discuss these things on the right. To quote The Rock, it doesn't matter what the UN thinks. Yeah, that tends to be. They'll send a strongly worded letter, but other than that, what are they actually going to do? Okay, Papa Smurf said, "This is the funniest thing that Trump admin 2 is probably ever going to do. We don't have to justify our actions to gay race communists. Just enjoy the show." Unquote. Um, yeah, and Blake said the same thing. The United States' next move, if any move, question mark. Blake, that's the part where I'm really wanting to watch this and see what happens next. Yeah, I one of the things too that I have also learned is the United States is the preeminent economic and military superpower in the world. With all of our problems, with all of our issues, we are still the preeminent economic and military superpower in the world. And a lot of times we deal with regimes where, like, I will see the Biden administration or the Obama administration act as if we can argue along Western values and get the same results, when in reality, they need to see that we're actually serious about utilizing the power that we have. And so there is something to be said about the judicious use of military, economic, and military power as a preventative measure, because dictatorships, communists, Islamists, they respect power. And they don't respect soft power. Soft power, by the way, soft power is a joke. Soft power only works when it's backed up by a mountain of hard power. That's the reality. And so I think if we were to define the Trump administration foreign policy, I think it's probably a little bit closer to Teddy Roosevelt's than any other president I can think of. And again, I had issue with Teddy Roosevelt too. I think he did some good things. I think he did some bad things, but I think that's what it's like. It's the idea that Trump wants our enemies to know that he is not afraid to use military power, and that doesn't mean he's going to waste 2 decades trying to fix your country for you. It may be that he's just going to jack your ass up so you understand not to mess around. Just Me said, recent retired intel guy, I love my country, but our founders will be rolling in their graves today, having lived where I did. I have concerns, but pray things work out. Prayers for all of us. Yeah, Just Me, I think here's the question on that one with respect to the founders. Is this more of a is this something they would have rolled in their graves over, or is this something that Jefferson would have looked more like as a response to the Barbary Pirates? And I don't know the answer to that yet. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the war, when you look at the Marine Corps hymn, and it talks about from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Shores of Tripoli. That's a reference to the Barbary Pirates, where the Barbary Pirates were actively press ganging U.S. sailors. And when the United States questioned them on why are you doing this? We've never had an issue with the Barbary states. We've never had an issue with anything. We have nothing to do with any of your internal conflicts or regional conflicts. And the response was essentially, well, because you're infidels. Because you're infidels, we have the authority to do this. And for a while, tribute was paid as like safe passage. But I'm pretty sure I think it was under Jefferson and Madison. Forgive me for not knowing that specifically, but we actually launched a small scale invasion of the Barbary states and took Tripoli as in response. Now, the differences between those two things is that the argument would be well, the Venezuelan military wasn't press ganging U.S. sailors into military service. The argument back to that would be no. Instead, what the Venezuelan military does is they're shipping drugs into the United States. And so that's where, again, when I look at how would the founders look at this, I think you would have some founders that you're absolutely right. I think they would agree with you that this is an act of war without a declaration of war. And so they would be very, very skeptical of this. I think other founders might look at it as, well, no, this is more like kind of like the Barbary Wars. Again, I want to see what they actually have in mind. Sergeant Kelvin Semper Fi. Whitfield, I have on my bingo card that Trump will model this announcement after the Baghdad announcement of the capture of Saddam in 2003. What's on your bingo card? Can I see Trump going out there like, Maduro is captured, our guys went in with dogs, beautiful dogs. If you've never seen the Shane Gillis rendition of Donald Trump talking about talking about when they got, was it Baghdadi that they captured? He died like a dog. So no, I think we should expect a Trump press conference to be exactly what we expect a Trump press conference to be. And it will definitely be, he will give a lot of props. He'll give a lot of props to his administration. He will lay out some of the reasons why he did this, and he'll give a lot of props to the military. Our great guys and gals in the military pulled off this beautiful operation. So we'll see. Thank you for again, I couldn't remember off the top of my head. He goes, it started in Washington's term. I knew that. That's correct. Where Jefferson pushed for a harsh response. Adams came in, went so far. Jefferson came in, no declaration of war, went harsh. War of 1812 comes about, then Madison. So yeah, it took place over several administrations with respect to the Barbary, the wars against the Barbary pirates. But yeah, it was a fairly complex military operation that was launched by Thomas Jefferson, who, again, a legit founder and certainly skeptical of government power, more so than like Alexander Hamilton and others, but still believed that it was under the power of the executive in order to met out a harsh punishment on the Barbary states in order to protect our sailors. And the question will be for a lot of people as they look at the Barbary Wars, is they will look at, okay, was there sufficient evidence to suggest that the cartels in Venezuela were operating through the government to traffic drugs into the United States as a direct kind of subversive attack on the United States? I actually think the evidence for that is convincing. And then it'll be the question is, was this an appropriate response in line with what you actually saw founders approve of and debate over? And again, we'll just have to see. Okay. So I'm gonna go for a couple more minutes here if anybody has any last minute questions. But then I want everyone to be able to go off and to be able to watch the press conferences as we will as next time when I figure out the stupid audio. We'll definitely have this up and running in the process to where we can actually watch these things live, have it going up. But again, I'm working with technical issues right here. Yeah, the eternal page, all wars are Israel inspired. That's just absolute garbage. Like there's nothing to that reasoning. That's just ridiculous. My gosh. Between Iran's revolution, Venezuela's situation, Russia, Ukraine, China is a tough spot for oil resources with recent posturing from China, Japan, and Taiwan. Do you think Taiwan wars soon? That's a good question. So I think China's main focus right now is actually Malaysia. And part of that's because they're trying to get a port where they can get oil from the Middle East without having to go through the Malacca Straits. Because the United States Navy could shut down the Malacca Straits fairly quickly if we wanted to. And they are thinking strategically, both from an economic standpoint, but also from a military standpoint, how do they secure their access to oil? When it comes to launching a massive amphibious operation, so the arguably the largest amphibious operation launched in world history was D-Day, right? That was launched across the English Channel. And it was a relatively short, what is it, like a little over 20 miles, I think, across the English Channel. Massive invasion against another country that was fighting a two-front war. And most of the crack troops in the German military had been deployed to the Eastern Front. So a lot of the people, you had Rommel, and Rommel was obviously a very, very capable and competent commander, but you didn't necessarily have the best of the German army in Normandy. Not to say that we couldn't have pulled it off anyways, but very complex operation. When you talk about China trying to invade Taiwan, yeah, they've got a 1 million man army and all that good stuff, and they built a lot of ships. The problem is this: the tides make it really, 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 really difficult. Like the weather patterns, not tides, but the weather patterns and everything like that within the Taiwan Strait make it very, very hard to just willy-nilly launch an invasion anytime you want. We're talking about 100 miles of ocean. And then you not only got to establish a foothold, but you have to establish a foothold against Taiwan, which is essentially has 2 million reserves, which I promise you, there's not going to be a sneak attack that the Taiwanese don't know about ahead of time. So they're going to mobilize the reserves. And now you got to think about what is the logistical framework necessary to sustain, let's say, 300,000 Chinese troops crossing the water, because they're not going to send all 1 million troops, right? Let's say 300,000. That'd be massive. The amount of the amount of ships necessary, the amount of air support necessary, all of that necessary in order to not only establish a beachhead, but then to move inland against a very, very difficult, rocky. It's a difficult place to fight long term. I just don't see them being able to pull that off. Now, if they wanted to just start bombing it, okay, well, they could, but that's going to also elicit a reaction and probably widespread support for Taiwan. And then it also begs the question, what do the Chinese gain from that? If they just bomb it, what do they gain? And so I really don't think China's in a position they can saber rattle over Taiwan all they want, and they could do damage if they wanted to, but pulling off an invasion of Taiwan is not something I think the communist or the CCP's military is capable of at this point. What's another one? Nick for president? No, no, but thank you. Historical, look up Rear Admiral Jose America Bubo. DEA rolled him up in 2013. He was a Commissar Admiral involved in the international drug trade. That is interesting. That is interesting because again, it'll kind of factor into this. Okay. I think I'm going to. Okay, we got one more. Every day, Trump behaves more and more like the neocon globalists that he pretended to oppose in order to get elected by naive, gullible patriots. I just don't agree with your analysis on that. Again, the neocon. Think about what you're saying here for a second. Neocon globalists had this idea that we were going to fight a series of conflicts overseas in order to make the world safe for democracy, that we were fighting in large part not for necessarily for U.S. interests, but for some sort of moral imperative, that we had the obligation to again make the world safe for democracy. This really kind of goes back to the heart of progressive era politics under Woodrow Wilson. So this idea that Trump is behaving just like that, this is the problem I have. If C. Calvinists were to say, hey, I have some issues with this because I feel like this is once again Trump getting tempted into doing things that we shouldn't be doing, I'm like, okay, that's fair. Let's talk about it. But as soon as he's nothing but a neocon global, I'm sorry, I don't think there's sufficient evidence to back up that statement. And the flippancy of the statement causes me to think, all right, was this just a preconceived notion that you already had? Did you not like Trump in the first place? Are all of us just stupid and gullible because we support the things that Trump is doing? Am I not allowed to like the fact that he's trying to get rid of the Department of Education, which I think is a horrible department of the federal government because he did a strike in Iran, or he did a strike or did this operation in Venezuela? Like, this is the part where I get frustrated with the very, very simple arguments where it's like, no, it's all this. This is what explains everything. Like, I just don't buy it, man. I just don't buy it. Okay. Once again, I think I'm gonna cut off right there because I want to go ahead and get set up and take a look at what Trump's going to say. It should be interesting. This is something that we need to watch because hopefully, this has not become something where we actually get involved in like a large scale military deployment, that we don't see ourselves as obligated to, help Venezuela sort out Venezuela. I hope it's a limited operation, and we'll see where it goes from there. But I think people have a right to be concerned and they have a right to be skeptical. I think you can be happy that Maduro's gone. I think you can be hopeful that Venezuela will usher in a new, political administration that will actually respect, human rights, individual liberty, and have a favorable view toward the United States, without accepting that that's the only possible outcome at this stage. And so that's what we need to do. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. Let's see what Trump has to say about it. Again, I'm someone that I'm skeptical of foreign U.S. military involvement, but I am willing to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt. But the only person that gets my absolute loyalty is Jesus Christ. Everyone else has to show ID. Once again, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.